I lived in a small apartment complex in Ohio. I've been living here for many years, ever since it was still relatively new until now, when it's been rather a rundown place and there were a lot of rumors about it being haunted. The complex was not of a most modern or cozy one, but due to the rather cheap rent, it's still getting fully booked. It's a 5-level building with 3 on each floor, so 15 apartments, where I lived on the 3rd floor. Because it was rather cheap, the majority of the tenants here were college students, and some were of the elderly. I lived in the middle apartment, sandwiched between Cassie, a senior year student, and Maddie, a 57-year-old. Since she's a senior, Cassie spent the majority of her time occupied with studying and preparing for the final exam. For many days, the apartment above where she lived continuously echoed with loud noises. It's like the sound of nails or chisel being hammered into the wall. At first, she'd tried ignoring it, but it kept going and going to the point that it drove her to lose her temper. This morning, Cassie finally snapped. She decided to walk upstairs to have a word with that annoying person. When walking up to the doorway, she politely knocked on the door, but even after a while, there wasn't anyone who came out to greet her. Also, the hammering stopped. Cassie, thinking it was the jerk who knew what she's here for and trying their best to avoid confrontation, began knocking harder. The frustration, combined with the total ignorance from the lousy neighbor, prompting Cassie to begin shouting and knocking more and more. The tenant still adamantly refused to come out, prompting her to twisting the doorknob, then shoulder barge through. The door wasn't locked by any means. Needless to say, it was spooky. Yet Cassie, after a few minutes hesitating, decided to go in and ask the tenant about the noise complaint. But strange enough, the living room was absolutely empty, as if nobody's living here at all. Curious, she went further into the apartment. Knowing clearly that there's nobody actually living here, she was pretty certain about herself. All she needed to know was where the heck did the hammering for many days come from? Going further, Cassie heard a man's mumbling. The mumbling seemed to be rushing up quicker and quicker. Cassie, following the sound, attentively listening to the man's word,
13, 13, 13.
Pushed open the bedroom right next to the living room. Everything here remained empty. As soon as she came into the room, the mumbling stopped, as if someone just turned off the cassette tape recording right away. In the corner of the room, there's an old doll. Approaching closer, Cassie shuddered at the creepiness of the doll. The face of it was superbly done. At first glance, she thought it was a 5-year-old baby girl with a body full of scars. The body of the dolls, however, was made of cloth and full of dirt, and there's something like blood. Cassie slowly crouched over the doll, then lifted its arm up. It was really heavy, and then suddenly, she found that blood seemed to ooze out from the doll and soak over Cassie's hands. A nasty stench immediately assaulted Cassie's nose, gagging her. Immediately, she threw away the doll and quickly made it out of the room. Back in her room, Cassie tried her best to clean out the blood, but seemingly couldn't wash it out. She collapsed on her bed, breathed laboriously. Was it just because of all those activities or the air in the rooms getting thicker? The sound of mumbling suddenly returned, of the same man with the same monotonous sound of the counting. 13, 13, 13. Too frightened, Cassie closed her eyes and covered her ears. When she came back to her senses, it had been a very long time past and it's already dark outside. Cassie jumped to her phone. It showed 11:59 p.m. The crimson red blood on her hands was no longer there. She felt the sharp pain rang over her temples. Was it real life or just a fantasy dream? There was a sudden alarm on her clock at exactly 0 o'clock. Cassie jumped over to her phone. Weird. She'd never set the alarm on this weird hour. However, the note on the phone said it was just a number. 13. The sound of mumbling suddenly appeared on the front door. 13, 13, 13, followed by the sound of walking, but sounded just like hammering on wood. Now it was clear. The sound of hammering was, in fact, something supernatural walking. Cassie immediately jumped over the front door, locking it shut. Glancing over the peephole, she could see a weird-looking shadow of something humanoid. It was just like a very drunken person trying to walk, neck canted to one side. The sound of hammering echoed at its every step. The mumbling seemed like it's echoing from that shadow. Cassie felt like all her hair was standing straight up at the scene. Yet despite her mind screaming to her to run away, her body was frozen at the peephole, staring at the shadow. The shadow walked closer to Cassie's apartment doorway and showing the face as the doll upstairs. The doll leaned over, staring, its eyes locked on Cassie's. A giggle came out too close, which prompted Cassie to walk backwards, and she suddenly felt like something was there on her back. She turned around, staring face to face with the doll now giggling right behind her. Before she was able to let out any scream, the doll jumped at her. After that, Cassie's missing for everyone in the apartment complex. Not just Cassie, but Maddie disappeared a few days later. One by one, the tenants disappeared without a trace until only I remained. The mumbling of the man became more and more frequent. His mumbling had also changed, as if counting from 13 to 20. It's been a month since the 20th disappearance in this apartment complex. Now I'm looking for the 21st person to play too. I'm Dante, 45 years old. I'm the sheriff of the Phoenix Police Department, Arizona. As a sheriff, I have undergone and dealt with every kind of case. Only the case at the abandoned house on the city's outskirts keeps haunting me and my colleagues. That was the winter of 18 years ago, in the evening, when I was an investigator officer on the night shift. At midnight, there was a call at the department. I picked up the phone in a rush. That was the dispatcher. With a rather confused and urgent voice, he told me about the phone call he had had. A man with a calm tone called them. I just choked a few people, and now they aren't breathing. Then, suddenly, he laughed as if he were crazy. Number 13, McDowell Street. The man stated the address and then quickly hung up. My two colleagues and I immediately headed over to the address as we knew. When we got there, we saw it was a big house in a rich neighborhood. The house was dark and quiet. We knocked a bunch of times, but nobody answered or opened the door. In the end, we had to break a window so David, our smallest officer, could climb in and unlock the door from the inside. As soon as we got inside, our flashlight stopped working, even though it was fine just a few seconds ago. We felt an intensive smell like fish in the air. On the floor, there was a sticky liquid. After fumbling around for a bit, we finally found the light switch. When the lights came on, we saw a horrifying scene. A layer of dark red blood was on the floor, spreading and soaking into the expensive fur carpet. We searched the whole house but didn't find any unusual signs or the owner. According to the investigation, this house belongs to a wealthy couple named Thomas and Daria. They have 2 kids together. After examination, they concluded that the blood on the floor was enough for 5 or 6 adults. However, Mr. Thomas's family has 4 people and 2 young children. The neighbors around insisted that this fancy house had been empty for about a month. Our team worked for 3 months and still didn't find any clues or bodies. We couldn't track down the location of the person who called the police that evening. The case eventually hit a dead end, but my colleagues and I didn't give up. The Thomas family's house was sealed off for further investigation. A month later, the police got a call saying the door of the house had been opened. We also got a lot of reports from the neighbors saying they heard occasional laughter coming from the house. The investigation team showed up right away. When we walked into the house, we all heard kids laughing. Following the laughter, we went upstairs and found a glowing toy car. One of my colleagues said he must have just seen that car on the first floor. We all just stood there, looking at each other with confused and suspicious expressions. The house still doesn't show any other unusual signs. One evening, the police got a report that some kids coming home from school saw light on the second floor of house number 13. This time, we confirmed that someone was still living in the house. We armed, just in case. When we entered the house, we quickly checked the first floor and then headed up to the second floor. Suddenly, all the lights on the second floor turned on and it startled us. At that moment, David seemed like he was in a trance. He sprinted toward the stairs and jumped down, surprising everyone. As soon as David landed, the gun in his hand went off with a loud bang. My remaining teammates and I looked at each other, totally shocked. When he got to David, he was lying face down in a big pool of blood with a gaping hole in his head. David's sudden and bizarre death left me and the rest of the team in shock. Rumors about house number 13 on McDowell Street started spreading everywhere. The house was even more tightly sealed off. A few months later, when the investigation had stalled, neighbors told us a strange man was living in the abandoned house. When we arrested him, that guy kept insisting he had Mr. Thomas's permission to move in. So Mr. Thomas isn't dead after all. The investigation team has reopened the case about his family. The guy living there was named Leon. He said he was a longtime friend of Thomas. But when we asked him about Mr. Thomas's family, Leon said that Thomas and his wife had divorced a long time ago and that he was now single. We started to have doubts about what this guy was telling us. After carefully searching the whole house again, we found a big wooden box buried deep in the basement. Inside the wooden box were the mostly decomposed bodies of a woman and 2 small children. After examination, it was confirmed that the bodies were Mr. Thomas's wife and 2 kids. We showed Leon the photo to see if he could identify Mr. Thomas, the so-called longtime friend. He said that he had many similar features to his friend, but his features were much more youthful. He pointed out that his friend Thomas had a big mole at the end of his left eyebrow, but this guy didn't have that. I looked up Thomas's family records and found out that his dad and grandpa were also named Thomas. The case of the house at 13 McDowell Street turned into a confusing mess and became a murder that shocked the whole country at the time. That guy named Leon hanged himself in house number 13 just 3 days later. All investigation work on the case has been on hold to this day. The members of our investigation team that year still remember our unlucky teammate David and hope that one day they'll find clues to solve the case. I'm David. 7 years ago, I finished my studies at Stanford University, California. I'm stressed thinking about what job I will do and which city to choose to live in. My parents are elderly. They live on pensions in their hometown of Montana. In a few days, I will move out of the school dormitory. I constantly searched for information about cheap apartments on student groups and found a place about 8 kilometers from my dormitory. It is a fairly small 2-story house, including 2 bedrooms on the second floor, living room, and kitchen on the first floor. This house is being rented by Kevin, 25 years old. He wants to find a roommate and reduce costs because Kevin has a fairly low income as a cashier at a convenience store. When I moved in, I was very surprised with the space and interior of the house. Everything is complete and comfortable. Really great compared to the amount of money we rented. When I asked about the landlord, Kevin said he would come check the house quarterly. The rental contract Kevin had already prepared and just needed to sign it. Kevin is a quiet but kind person. Kevin helped me arrange things in the room and told me to let him know if I needed anything. The next days I sent my resumes everywhere looking for a job. One evening, I stayed up late to talk to my friends about work and upcoming plans. When I accidentally turned around, I was startled and almost dropped the phone when I saw Kevin standing at the door, looking at me with wide eyes. "I've been looking for my phone all night," Kevin answered me in an emotionless whisper. Looking down, I told Kevin in surprise that the phone was in his hand. Kevin slowly looked down at the phone in his hand, then without saying anything more, left for his room. He must be sleepwalking, I think. Another night I was half awake and half dreaming, feeling that the bed was more uneven today. When I moved, I felt like someone was lying next to me. I woke up and saw Kevin lying next to me, in a neat position, his hands on his stomach, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I jumped up and screamed loudly. I got angry and asked Kevin why he was here. He maintained his lying position, slowly turning his head to look at me. "I'm so scared. It keeps clinging on to me. It wants to eat me." I sighed at the thought of Kevin sleepwalking again and pulled him back to his room and quickly went back to sleep because I had an interview tomorrow. The next morning I returned home at 11 a.m. after the interview. Hearing a shaky mumbly coming from upstairs, I ran up and saw Kevin sitting huddled in front of the door. Now that I look closely, Kevin is much thinner. His face is haggard and his eyes blackened. Kevin kept muttering incomprehensible things about death. I asked worriedly, but he didn't seem to hear anything. His mouth mumbled faster, his face showing fear and panic. I went to help Kevin up, but he reacted very strongly and pushed my hand away. He said he was out of breath and thirsty. I quickly ran to pour water, but when I returned, Kevin was gone. Pushing open Kevin's room door, I saw him lying on the bed, covered with a blanket. I put the glass of water on the bedside table and went out. Did he go through something terrible? A week later, I was accepted and had a job that matched my qualifications. One late afternoon after coming home from work, I was startled to see a strange man about 60 years old in the house. He was tall and thin, with many strange tattoos on his arms. I was quite impressed with his beard and long hair tied back. It turned out he was the owner of this house. He said he came to inspect the house and end the lease with Kevin. I was very surprised, so Kevin left without saying anything to me. The landlord told me to find more roommates to reduce costs because maybe in the next few months he will increase the rent a bit. The homeowner moved away and I was still thinking about Kevin. He left without taking anything with him, which was strange. About a week later, I was busy with a new job. The post looking for a roommate also received a lot of attention, but I haven't been able to reply to all of them. One night I came home early after 3 consecutive days of overtime. Lying in bed answering messages from a few people interested in the house, I fell asleep without realizing it. I met Kevin, still with the same haggard face, eyes wide open in panic, whispering voice echoing hauntingly. "I'm cold. There's a rope around my neck. There are too many people here. They all look at me with scary eyes." Suddenly, Kevin let out a loud, shrill, and a painful scream. I jumped up, looked around the room in fear, then quickly reached out and turned on the light. Looking at the clock, it was just after 9 p.m. I calmed down and went down to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. I can't get out of my head thinking about Kevin. I searched every corner of the house with the thinking that this house must have some secret. I don't understand why I did that at that time. As if someone had instructed me, I suddenly remembered Kevin's bedroom. Unexpectedly, my guess was correct. Behind Kevin's bed, there was a door leading down to a place like the basement. I don't know if Kevin had discovered it yet. 40% of me right now is fear. The remaining 60% is curiosity. Holding the baseball bat from Kevin's room, I slowly walked down. I saw the dim light, reached the end of the stairs, and the scene around the basement made me dumbfounded. Many human skeletons and bodies that had not yet fully decomposed were tied tightly to the four walls. In the middle of the room was Kevin's body, tied to a wooden post, his face filled with pain and panic. Kevin's neck was tied tightly with a blank stone string, and a talisman was pinned straight to his chest. On the wall behind me were photos of many people. They were all young men. I saw Kevin's photo on it, and in the last photo, pasted in the red circle, is me. I'm Jacob. I live in Baldwin Park, California. That night, I and my two friends Roy and Ethan went to the KFC store in the city to have dinner. At the end of the meal, we didn't want to leave yet, so I invited two of my friends to play Truth or Dare. Ethan and I spun to Truth and told the secret about the girl we were paying attention to. When it was Roy's turn, he turned to Dare. I excitedly stood up and challenged Roy to go out of the store and perform a spell to call out to the devil. Roy is very superstitious of the supernatural beings, so he immediately refused. But Ethan and I were determined not to let Roy go. I tried to force Roy, and in the end he had no other choice but to comply. It was nearly 12 o'clock at night, and there were only us and 3 employees left in the restaurant. Looking through the window, his frightened and trembling appearance made Ethan and I burst out laughing. Ethan and I told each other that this would be an experience for Roy to become braver. But when we looked back through the window, we couldn't see Roy anymore. I told Ethan, in a few seconds he will scream loudly and rush in here. But 5 minutes later, Roy still hasn't appeared. Ethan said that Roy was probably trying to lure me and Ethan out there and scare us to startle us. Ethan and I happily held back our laughter and went out. We decided to ruin Roy's joke. But walking around the store still couldn't find Roy. I looked for him in the parking lot, and Ethan ran into the store's restroom to search, but Roy was still nowhere to be found. I called Roy's phone. The other end picked up, but there was a very long silence. I turned off the phone, feeling annoyed with Roy's prank. I pulled Ethan home, ignoring Roy. At that time, I selfishly only thought about my own feelings without thinking about Roy's fear of being forced to do something he was so afraid of. I got home at 2 a.m. and went to sleep. The next morning, Ethan and I went to Roy's house. His sister opened the door and said that Roy didn't come home last night. She called many times, but Roy's phone said he couldn't be reached. Ethan and I looked at each other in surprise. I immediately took the phone and called Roy, and the other end picked up. We happily stared at our phones. I quickly asked where Roy was. He didn't answer. I called Roy many times, but the response was still silence. Feeling that this was serious, my sister Roy and I decided to report it to the police. Police reviewed security cameras at the KFC Baldwin Park store. The image on the camera recorded after performing the demon summoning spell, Roy headed towards the store's parking lot. But when taking image data from the parking lot camera, Roy was nowhere to be seen. Only saw a red shadow passing by while Roy was wearing blue clothes. Continue investigating Roy's disappearance. The police said I should call him so they can trace his location via the phone signal. Once again, this option failed when the police signal tracking system failed to pinpoint his exact position. Where did he end up? That's the question that's always on my mind. It's been a week since Roy went missing, and all police search efforts have come to a dead end. I'm really confused and regretful. I wish I hadn't thought of that stupid game. One evening, I was having a meal in the kitchen when I accidentally looked out the window and suddenly saw Roy. Roy smiled when he knew I saw him. I stood up and called out happily. Roy smiled devilishly, 2 sharp fangs and bloodshot eyes. I was stunned for a few seconds. Looking closely again, Roy returned to his normal state. Rushed out, but Roy had disappeared. Maybe I was wrong. I've been thinking too much about Roy these past few days. It was around 12 o'clock that night that I went to bed. When I was about to lie down, I saw Roy again outside the window with a devilish smile. I was so scared. How could he be there? My room was on the 3rd floor. Getting out of bed, walking towards the window, I slowly put my hand on the handle and opened the window. But there was no one there, just the dark and quiet space of the night. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying laugh rang out, and I turned around in surprise. Immediately, Roy, with wide eyes, wide mouth, bearing 2 sharp fangs, rushed to push me down. I lay in a pool of my own blood, looked up and saw Roy's face gradually turning into Satan's. Roy looked at me and laughed loudly. I screamed loudly and jumped up. The terrible dream I had just made my head hurt. My heart beat so hard it was hard to breathe. Quickly looked towards the window. It had been open for some time. I quickly rushed to close the window and close the curtains. The next morning, my body felt like it was drained of all its strength. Lying in bed, I called Ethan. I wanted to tell him about last night's dream. Ethan's mother answered the phone. She was sobbing, her voice distorted. Ethan crashed through the window from the 13th floor of his apartment last night. He was lying in a pool of blood with his body in pieces. I was dumbfounded by what I just heard. I turned around to look at the window. The curtains had been pulled open. On the glass window was printed the left hand with the index finger and little finger pointing up, while the remaining fingers were bent down. I'm Elon. I'm a high school student in Houston, Texas. I'm an open-minded individual and quite enjoy extracurricular activities at school. One time, my class was informed that they would participate in a community service cleanup session at a local park. Even though I wasn't very excited, being able to run outside was better than having to sit and study, I thought. It was Sunday morning. We arrived at the park at 9 o'clock and were assigned areas to clean. This park has just been built in recent weeks, and there are still some areas in the finishing stages. Me, Anna, and Max were assigned to clean up an area with a very large rock. It was high above my head and placed in a small flower garden. I observed the rock and saw that it had a very strange shape. There's also a cross engraved on the stone, but it seems to be upside down. I told Anna and Max, but they didn't pay attention to what I said. I guess I'm no expert in landscaping, I muttered. Ignoring the stone's strange appearance, we started cleaning. Max and Anna picked grass in the flower garden, and I will plant a few new flowers. We do this while chatting about interesting stories at school. As it neared the end, I started to smell a terrible stench. It was really nauseating. Anna and Max also noticed that unpleasant smell. We went around the area we were responsible for to find out the source, but didn't find anything unusual. At the end of the labor session, all of us were told to regroup. My team has thoroughly checked the area we are in charge of, so we are confident that everything is clean. It was probably some dead mice somewhere else, and the wind brought in the stench. We told each other that and happily left. A few days later, we organized a picnic ourselves at the park we cleaned, this time with Ethan and Mary. Returning to the flower garden the other day, we were happy because the newly planted flower trees were lush. My friends and I spread out the carpet next to it, ate together, chatted, and took pictures. About 15 minutes later, it suddenly started to rain. We quickly packed up our things and ran to a nearby shack to shelter from the rain. Where we were standing outside the rock, a brown liquid began flowing out. The stench rose again. This time it was much worse. We were stunned to see that strange thing and looked at each other, confusing and scared. About 20 minutes later, the rain stopped. Me, Max, and Ethan came closer for a better look. Mary and Anna fearfully huddled in the shack. Even though I was scared, a feeling of curiosity was taking over me. Reaching out to brush a few flower plants next to the rock away, a feeling of dizziness immediately hits me. I saw human fingers crushed under the stone and they were decomposing. I scream out in fear, almost to a panic attack, crawled out to yell at my friends to quickly call the police. The police arrived and immediately searched the scene. Max and I stayed behind to give our statements to the police, while Ethan took Anna and Mary home first because they were so panicked. The police found out that there was a body crushed underneath and immediately sent the tow to move the stone away. Seeing the entire scene unfold, I was shocked to the core by the corpse underneath. The body was no longer in one piece. It was decomposing. The stench and sight was horrifying to witness. The police thanked Max and I for the cooperation, then told us to go home first. Maybe during construction the stone was placed in a different position and collapsed over the poor worker while he was inspecting the project. So my feeling about the stone's strange position is correct. The man's body was processed and returned to his family. That stone was later demolished by the park management board and a flower garden was planted in its place. To this day, that scene still haunts me. Extracurriculars now brings me the dreads. I always imagined that I would discover another terrible thing around there.